Good evening, Wade.
Good morning, Rob. How's life treating you this fine day?
Well, it's a very hot summer here in Metro Manila. It's hotter than it's been all year, but I think it's very apt that for such a hot day, we have such a smoking hot occult-wise guest for the show. Okay, you and I go back to the early '90s. You probably go earlier than that into occultism, and one of the names that I remember that was in my life when I started my journey, when I was getting deeper into it, was a very interesting author I picked up at the Psychic Eye. The author of the book was the name of the book was called Condensed Chaos, and it was written by a gentleman named Phil Hine. But reading that book put me in a rabbit hole that just got deeper and deeper into the study of chaos magic, urban shamanism, and I eventually stumbled upon his website, and I just really fell in love with it all. So with that being said, the show being well, I wanted to ask you, what were your experiences with Phil Hine, our guest tonight, before anything else? What was your first experience with him?
Well, I've never met him. We didn't have him at Ancient Ways, but I did. Someone had given me Condensed Chaos. Mm-hmm. I had gone through to read that, and the book was a gut punch, because I'd been hearing about people talking about, oh yeah, well, chaos magic is chaos, and I thought, oh, okay, this sounds like the punk rock of magic. I don't know what to believe about this, and I put off checking it out, and then I'm reading it. It's like, oh, this is absolutely amazing. It's like chaos in a scientific sense.
Exactly.
The power of the thing that really shaped my philosophy was the power of something undefined.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And what I really loved about that was during the time, you were right, it was like the punk rock, and you didn't really know your left hand from your right hand. And the book Condensed Chaos was one of the only things to actually, at the time, systematize it and make it understandable in an academic point of view. So without further ado, I am honored, I am blessed, I am privileged to welcome to Magic.tv none other than occult legend Phil Hine. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, Mr. Hine. How are you today?
I'm very well. How are you?
Doing great. Well, welcome to Magic.tv, sir. It's an honor to have you.
It's my pleasure.
All right, sir. Just to get the show on the road, we just want to know more about you. How did it all start for the legendary Phil Hine? What was your first foray into occultism that inspired you to jump into this topic, which you ended up contributing so much to? We want to know about your history, sir.
You want to know how I got started?
Yes, please.
Okay, well, I thought the occult was bullshit, basically, until I was about 16 or 17. And I remember this very well. This was my turning point. I was sitting in the school library, and I found they had bound copies of Myth, Man and Magic, which was a part work from the 70s, like a magazine kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And I was looking for pictures of nude witches, which I think is, a perfectly legitimate thing to do when you're 16 or 17. And I came across a picture, a photograph of a painting by Austin Spare. And that kind of thought, oh, that's really interesting. So I was really into Jung at the time, and I think I'd just been reading Man and His Symbols, and there was something about that painting that kind of like gelled with me. And I kind of thought, oh, well, maybe there's actually something in all this occult rubbish after all. That kind of is what got me started, really. I kind of ran to the local library and read everything that was on the occult in the local library, which was not a great choice, I have to admit. It was a lot of theosophical stuff and a lot of Dennis Wheatley's and spiritualist things. But, I got interested and I started reading loads of books, as you do. And I eventually found a book by David Conway, Magic and Occult Primer. And I think that was the first book that actually gave me practical instructions in occultism. And I started doing some of the things in Magic and Occult Primer and testing them out, making my own, magical instruments and things. Mm-hmm. And then when I was 18, I moved to Huddersfield, which is a kind of very industrial town in northern England to do a joint honours degree in psychology. When I was at Huddersfield, I actually, got in contact with some actual people, other people involved in the British occult scene. And it all kind of like bobbled away from there, really.
All right. So if you don't mind me asking, like, I'm sure you mentioned this in the private chats that you veered away from your early publishing work, which is chaos magic. But I'm curious, how did you find yourself going from conventional occultism to the chaos magic practice, even to the point of you writing so profusely about it? I mean, what made that your initial output?
Okay, well, I first got it. I arrived, as I say, in Huddersfield at the age of 18 and started knocking around on the fringes of the British occult scene as it was. And I guess there were two strands to my early experiments. One was I joined a very traditional magical order who was doing like a postal course. They didn't have online courses in those days. They had postal courses. You signed up for something by post and they sent you exercises and you sent your kind of feedback and they told you how good or bad you were doing. And I did a postal course in, I guess, fairly basic Western esoteric tradition, so Kabbalah, Middle Pillar, all that stuff. But I also started reading H.P. Lovecraft. And I started thinking, well, this is really magical. Let's see if I can do some rituals using some of Lovecraft's ideas. Because I didn't make a distinction between, if you like, different genres of the occult in those days. It was all occult, whether it was astrology or Zen or Lovecraft or Kabbalah. It was just all the same, this big, that kind of like stuff to make it. It's all a big pie, I guess. And so at the same time, I was doing traditional Kabbalah exercises and doing path workings to Great Cthulhu. I also found a copy of one of the very first books on chaos magic, Ray Sherwin's little book, The Book of Results, which was a practical guide to doing stuff with sigils. So I started experimenting with sigils as well. And chaos magic as a thing, I don't think was really around then. I mean, this is, chaos magic is something that developed over a 10, 12-year period. People weren't really talking about chaos magic as a thing, but some of the very early ideas that are now associated with chaos magic were being bandied about. And I got this little book, The Book of Results, and started doing sigils. And I remember writing to the guy who was moderating the postal course I was doing, and saying, I've been doing this stuff with sigils. And he was like, oh, you shouldn't do that. That's really dangerous. And I was like, come on, get a life, So I just started experimenting. And I think I was really fortunate that at the time, because I knew very few people, I didn't know anybody who would turn around and say, oh, you shouldn't be like trying to, do magic with Lovecraftian entities, they'll fuck you up or suck your brains out and stuff like that. There was nobody to say that, so I just went ahead and tried it out and saw what happened.
I have a question about that, just a little bit veering away from that, since you said you did attempt to work with Lovecraftian entities. I believe it was in one of the early issues of Chaos magazine. It was an interesting early turn of the 2000s e-zine that they talked about something called Necronomicon burnout, where people who would, even though the book, the Necronomicon, was said to be fictional, you'd see a lot of new young mages get melted down by this apparently fictional book. Now, I was wondering, did you ever get any results working with Lovecraftian entities, even if some people would say that they are fictional?
Yeah, of course I did.
Wow, and what was that like for you? Okay,
well, there's two early experiments, both done whilst I was at Huddersfield, spring to mind. One is I tried to evoke Yog-Sothoth on top of a mountain in the dead of night. That didn't go too well. I kind of basically scared myself shitless and ended up running down the side of the mountain at 3 o'clock in the morning, absolutely like terrified, and ended up at a mate's house on the edge of the village and him going, I told you something like that would happen, you shouldn't have done it. So that was a result, as of course I managed to scare myself silly. And one of the other early experiments, which is written up in my little book, The Pseudonomicon, was a Cthulhu path working. And I kind of, there's this idea in Lovecraft that Cthulhu is the Lord of Dreams, and he sends out telepathic signals through the ocean currents that, sensitives and mad cultists all over the world can pick up on. So I thought, I'd really like to meet some more occultists who are living in Huddersfield. Let's do a Cthulhu path working and see if I can send out a telepathic signal or whatever, to try and get in contact with other occultists. So I did this, and then I started meeting loads of people who are interested in the occult. Now, whether there's a causal link between me doing the path working and using Cthulhu and the result is, debatable, but, you could call that a result if you like. And I certainly did think of it in those terms.
Well, if you don't mind me asking, Mr. Hine, this is a little bit of a side question.
Oh, don't call me Mr. Hine. That sounds terrible. You sound like a job interviewer.
All right. One thing I noticed was during the pandemic, with everything in 2020, when everything was going to shit, one thing a lot of people were afraid of, that until midnight of 2020, people were convinced that the last hurrah was going to be Cthulhu was going to show up. Did you actually feel that was going to potentially happen in 2020?
No.
All right, thankfully, because everything was going so bad. I was like, shit, what's next? Cthulhu himself? Because wouldn't that be the topper of the cake?
If he turned up with Donald Trump, that would be a good idea, but I doubt that's going to happen anytime soon.
And your Cthulhu path working is available on the Pseudonomicon, am I correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And that's available on your website, enfolding.org, or is it somewhere else now?
No, that's a book, and it's available directly from my publishers, Original Falcon, or from Amazon.
All right,
or from any good occult bookshop,
Yeah, the Pseudonomicon, if you want to work with that. Now, it's
available as a print edition or as in a digital thing.
Now, I also wanted to ask that you mentioned recently now you're also studying into Tantra, and you're, of course, being an advocate of the queer aspect of occultism. What made that something that you've decided to champion, especially the queerying aspect of occultism? Because not too many people do it. The only other openly queer, I would like to say, occultist I was familiar with was Crowley. And we don't know what he was into, but it is something that takes a lot of courage, especially early on before it was openly accepted, which I'm happy it is now. What made you decide to champion that? Like, I want to be somebody who advocates this, because it is definitely. There you go.
There you go.
I love the book.
Queering Occultures. Okay, so let's talk about that. Well, I struggled with my sexuality for a long time before deciding I was bisexual. When I first got involved with the occult community in the UK in the early 1980s, let's say there was definitely a lot of homophobia around, mostly coming out in the form of arguments about, cosmic laws, divine polarity, block chakras, reverse kundalini, yada, yada, yada. Basically, if you're not straight, you can't do magic. And I was kind of like, oh. And then I kind of got a bit sad about that. And then I got angry about it. And I think I started to write from my own, if you like, queer experience by about the mid to late 80s. And I started to do lectures, and I started to push back against what I saw as this kind of like really, conservative homophobic attitude that, if you're not a heterosexual, you can't do magic. Which, I'm talking about Britain here. I think it probably was different in other parts of the world, but in Britain there was definitely a sense, a real kind of occult homophobia. It was almost like a cosmic law. And I remember reading this. There was this guy called Gareth Knight. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
Yeah.
He wrote this book, A Practical Guide to Kabbalistic Symbolism, which is, what it says on the tin, basically. But I was reading that one day, and in the middle of it, he starts going on about homosexuality is a form of black magic, and it is perversion and evil. Or he said homosexuality, like drugs, is a form of black magic, and it's a perversion and evil. And that was a kind of big moment for me, because I just thought, hang on, just because I fancy men I'm condemned to be a black magic, a black magician, and I'm evil, and I'm on the left-hand path. Fuck you.
Good point. And it's kind of funny that you said there was such a strong homophobia for occultism, knowing that like Crowley was from England, and he was known to be very much into querying experiences. So you think
he was
like
also widely hated.
Well,
I mean,
I think you
for
have
that
to
and other
realize,
reasons.
yeah, I think you have to realize that at the time in Britain, if you hung around in the wrong set, I mean, I remember a mate of mine going to some pagan do and admitting that he had a pack of the Thoth deck at home, and people were kind of, ooh, Crowley, ooh. And I think one of the reasons again was Crowley being, quite open about his sexuality, and a lot of people didn't like him because of that. Something I mentioned in the book is going to this lecture many years ago, and it was about the Crowley's sex magic with Victor Neuberg in the desert. Was it the Abel Days working? I can't remember. I'm crap at Crowley. But, the lecturer said something like, oh, we presume something homosexual took place. And I was sitting in the front row with my boyfriend at the time, and I was like, come on, tell us what we want to know, And the lecturer was kind of like, no. So I think, it's good that people, I think, now are more accepting about anything that veers away from the straight and narrow. But in the 80s and 90s, that certainly wasn't the case.
I think with Gardnerian witchcraft, I got initiated back in the 90s, and they had strict rules that the men were taught by the high priestess, and the women were taught by the priest, and that there was no other way to do it. And they also, this was one of my big beefs with Gardnerians, was that they would encourage teachers to have sex with their students. But it was considered, they said it had to be the opposite polarity, because like electricity flows from one to the other. This has to be done this way. And I thought, I don't know what they're doing now, but that's the way that they used to do it. And that was as recently, that was in the 90s. I don't know what they're doing now, but they did have.
I'm sure they've moved on from that. But I can remember going to witchcraft covens where they insisted on this, male-female polarity. It was kind of like a hard law. And I actually did meet a gay guy who told me that when he was in circle, he became straight. And I was kind of like, what? And I had other friends who, and I was in a coven for a while, and I was in several covens actually. And one high priestess did say to me, if you're gay or lesbian or bisexual, you can't be a witch. And I was going, I'm sitting here, but I'm not going to say anything, because I was kind of like not very confident then. But there was a lot of that attitude about, and I think it has changed for the better.
Definitely.
We actually had huge
work to be done.
That was kind of the death of Pantheacon, was when they had some of their prominent people were saying, okay, even trans people are not allowed in these rituals because we need to have real, quote unquote, women only. And that was 2013, I want to say.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned that big kind of Pantheacon thing in the book and the fallout around it. And I think that was really interesting because it sometimes takes events like that for people to actually kind of start talking about these kind of issues, because otherwise they just get swept under the carpet.
Well, Phil, I got to be honest. Thank you for being such an advocate for this, because I do feel that people's choice of, let's say, representation of their sexuality, everybody should have the freedom to that. And it should be respected across the board. And you, especially when you did early on, standing up for it the way you did has actually, if you ask me, paved the way for a lot of people to do the same. So from the bottom of my heart, for everybody who's been discriminated or has been marginalized, thank you. So we have a comment. We have a comment from somebody called Morgana. It says, fancy seeing you here, Phil. Greetings from fellow Brit Morgana Sitho. Well, welcome to the show, Morgana. All right. Now, the next thing I've noticed is you mentioned you got into Tantra. And I'm very curious about that, because when you started talking that you were getting into Tantra, I was like, but I thought Phil Hine just does chaos magic. So where did the whole tantric shift come into play, and what role does it play in your present practice?
Okay, well, we'll come back to queering a culture, but I'll talk about this now. I got into Tantra, let me think, what was it? I think that the thing that put the hook in me was actually about 1982, something like that. I mean, I was never kind of like, you know, I had no interest in Tantra particularly. And in 1981, I went to Israel and worked on the kibbutz for 6 months, which was kind of interesting, during the Falklands War. And I left Israel when Israel invaded Syria. So that was like, you know, early 1982, I think. And I came back and I thought, I'm going to have a break from all this magic stuff. It's really, you know, done my head in, and not in a good way. So I was living in the middle of nowhere in Lincolnshire. And I just thought, I'm just going to meditate and walk the dog and just kick back and relax. You know, no, I'm not going to read any magic books. I'm not going to be in contact with anybody. I'm just going to kind of like take it easy for however long it takes, you know. And I started having a recurring dream about the goddess Crowley. Totally out of the blue, you know. Same dream every night, you know. Meeting her in the cremation grounds, you know, hair flying everywhere, arms waggling about, grinning at me with fang teeth, and I'm just going, oh shit, you know, where the hell is this coming from? And you know, I did know, I think, who Crowley was, because I'd probably read far too many Kenneth Grant books by then. But I had no conscious interest in anything Indian. But that recurring dream, as I say, put the hook in me, and I didn't kind of like run out and, you know, try and buy a zillion books on Tantra. For a start, there weren't that many. But I thought, okay, well, you know, I'll just keep that bubbling away in the back of my mind, as it were. So to cut a long story short, I spent several years going back to Wicca, getting involved in some couple of experimental drama groups, which are real interesting. Then when I moved to Leeds in, I think it was 1986, I kind of reconnected with the Leeds chaos scene. And Leeds was great because it had this occult society at the university, and they used to put on lectures. And I went to this lecture, and it was this guy, friend of mine, turned out to be, who was in Amukos. Now, Amukos stands for the Arcane and Mystical Order of the Knights of Shambhala. It's got a very wacky cosmic title there, but it was a kind of like East-West magical order that took a lot of, if you like, tantric ideas and made them accessible to people from a Western background. So this is about, as I say, 1986, 1987, something like that. So I joined Amukos and took an initiation with this guy who's became my first tantric teacher, or was it my second? I can't remember. I'd had some brushes with tantric practitioners earlier, but this was my first sustained one. So it was a kind of like really weird, I guess, thing, because I was doing chaos magic and this westernized tantra practice at the same time, and I continued to do that throughout the 80s and 90s, and then by 1999, having, I think, written Prime Chaos and Condensed Chaos, I decided that I wanted to, you know, really do a deep dive into the tantric stuff, which I've been doing ever since, more or less.
All right, now I have a question though. You did, like I said, you did mention that you have veered away from chaos magic, but of course, like I like to say that sometimes if it works, even if you don't do a practice or you're not part of a practice anymore, some of the things that work you take with you. Now, with that being said, are there any tenets left or beliefs or things that you have done in the past with chaos magic that you still practice up to today, even though you kind of veer away from it?
I think so. I mean, I still do occasional sigils, usually really quickly, like in the middle of the washing up or something. I still reflect on a lot of my, you know, earlier statements on chaos magic and think, I don't, that's bollocks, I don't agree with that anymore. And then I might write something about saying, well, actually, when I wrote that, I was perhaps being less than honest with myself, so don't take it too seriously. And I've done a lot of work over the past couple of years with a woman called Patricia McCormack. I don't know if you're familiar with her.
No,
She's
I haven't heard.
a professor of continental philosophy at Anglia Ruskin University, and a top scholar in her field. She's got a very different approach to chaos magic than, let's say, a lot of people. And what we've been looking at is the idea of wonder as if you like, as a third trajectory. The way I tend to look at it is you've got two main trajectories in magic. There's if you like, the trajectory towards the transcendental, which is like union with our higher self or your holy guardian angel or some sense of a divine totality. And then you've got the trajectory that goes towards, if you like, material results, more money, big car, boyfriend, several boyfriends, girlfriend, several girlfriends, whatever, And then we've been talking about wonder as a third trajectory, which is not really purposive in the sense of the other two, but it's just about opening yourself and becoming vulnerable and finding magic in the everyday world and in small moments. So that's a kind of like a queering of chaos magic, if you like. And we've been doing some work on that over the past couple of years, but we haven't really managed to get any writing done about it.
Is there
So
any?
That's really powerful stuff. The idea that that the right and left hand path, which most people tend to look at something and they say, well, it's either this or that. But having the third one of saying, you know what, let's just see what the world is. That's a really powerful concept to get people exploring without necessarily having to have the purpose of, getting, the gaggle of lovers, the big car, or, becoming, doing your own navel gazing and doing all the spiritual development and all. So it's interesting having something else outside of that dichotomy. That was something that grabbed me right away out of your book, was when
go on.
Oh, okay. In the beginning, in the introduction, it grabbed me right away when you're saying everything else is defined by its opposite, that they have like men and women, light and dark, all of these things. And then the querying of it is saying, well, then there's this that isn't necessarily divine and doesn't really have an opposite.
Yeah,
that's why, when we're going through and doing all of the magical concepts that you want to put on your pentacle, the different forces you're going to work with, I always had left a space for the undefined. That where you pull stuff from to create it, or you send stuff to get to have it go away.
Again, this comes out of my Tantra practice, because a lot of non-dual Tantra is very much about finding wonder in the world. I would say that if you engage with some forms of Kashmir Shaivism, for example, you find that wonder is, if you like, the end goal is just to find astonishment and amazement in everything, even really small things. So that's, I guess, something that's come out of my Tantra practice that I'm now not even prescribing, but just suggesting might be an interesting direction for chaos magic to take itself. It's interesting that you mentioned the whole idea of the left hand and the right hand path, because that is I think a classic example of a binary distinction. It's like good, bad, and is like other binary distinctions. One is valorized over the other, and you get people saying, "Oh, I'm on the right hand path. I don't want any naughty left hand path people around here," or vice versa. I'm on the left hand path. I've transgressive. I've got a bolt through my head. Whatever, And I think the problem here is that binary thinking that we get trapped into so easily.
Which brings me to my next question, Phil. Since one of the things that we do read a lot about is the undefining, looking outside the conventional definitions. As an occultist, have you been able to work with the more defined systems like the Goatia? And have you had any success with that, especially lately? Like, would you want to do a conventional evocation, as they say in the Key of Solomon, the Goatia, or would you rather do it your own undefined way, or even create something on your own? What are your takes on this?
I actually did do a whole series of Goetic workings, I think, in about 1988. We used Crowley's Key of Solomon, and I did create a magical circle in my flat, which in retrospect might not have been the terribly good idea, but we did it with masking tape and we biro-ed the god names around it. So we created a triangle, and we evoked various spirits with, you know, various tweaks and twists to the rituals until we actually started getting some interesting results. And I was actually thinking of publishing all that stuff, but I'm still in two minds because a lot of it is really, I don't know. You know, something that me and the other people that were doing it at the time was like kind of like, this is getting really weird. It's kind of like the Goetic spirits like to do things. So in order to get us to invoke them more, to get them to do things, they're actually making our lives really weird. I mean, there was a whole brace of people who we, let's say, performed aggressive magic against using the Goetia in response to various circumstances. A friend of mine was sent a sheep's heart through the post with a little curse strip in it, which is really stupid because we just stuck that sheep's heart in a triangle and evoked, I think it might have been Glacial Bolus and 36 legions of demons, and went, fetch. You know.
Ouch.
And yeah, a lot of stuff like that happened, and it was kind of like, I started thinking in the end, you know, I'm getting addicted to using the Goetia. It's maybe not terribly a good idea. But one of the last things we did was an anti-queer bashing spell, or well, an anti-queer bashing ritual where we evoke some Goetia entity and all its little friends, and just sent them out across Leeds to discourage people who were like beating up women and beating up queers.
Well, I'm glad you did that, because nobody deserves to be beaten up just because of their personal sexual preference. So anyhow, well, thank you very much so far for the first segment of the show, learning more about you. Now, for the second segment of the show, I'm actually going to do something different just because it's you. Instead of asking you about current events, I want to focus on the more your take on the queerying of the next generation of occultism, because we got to admit, queer culture is here to stay. It's not going anywhere. It's getting more and more accepted. And the more people accept it, the more it's going to become more prevalent. The more it becomes more prevalent, the more it's going to be normalized. So with that being said, I would like you to share whatever you can about what your prediction, forecast, or even hope would be for the future generations of occultism, especially coming from the queer angle where everybody's allowed their own personal expression. Please enlighten us.
Okay, well, that's tricky because I must admit I don't really think about things like that too much. Let's go back to queering the cultures. I think is probably the best way I can answer that.
Sure.
You know, I've wanted to write about my own attitudes to, if you like, queer and magic for a very long time. I mean, I remember in the 80s, this is something I talk about in the book. In the late 80s, I was talking to this guy who was a Western ceremonial magician, gay, but very much, no, I'm not telling anybody. And I was saying, you know, it'd be really cool to do a book on queer magic. And he was like, well, you know, queers aren't interested in magic, and you know, magicians don't want to hear about queer shit. I was kind of like, oh. And I think, you know, that was an attitude then, but things have obviously changed hugely since then. And I would say since the late 90s, we've seen an increasing, you know, proliferation of queer writers, which I think is great, largely. A lot of that has come out of America, and I think America has had a very different, if you like, trajectory when it comes to queer rights and queer resistance than the UK. But again, that's great, you know, and it's you know, it's good to see that more people are engaging with occultism. My particular approach is to think of queer not only as an identity. You know, this is one thing that's very prevalent in the States. Queer is a kind of umbrella identity for anybody who's not heterosexual, or people who are heterosexuals and see themselves as queer. I'm totally okay with that idea. But to see queer as a mode of inquiry, a mode of practice, and if you like, a way of relating to things in an ethical way. So I'm kind of broadening out the idea of queerness when it intersects with magic, and trying to say, well, what happens if we go down this direction? What happens if we critique this idea? And that involves, for me, critiquing, you know, if you like, queer ideas as well.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Why not? I mean, I'd love to hear what your take on it, because, like, again, this is going to be something that's going to be more and more prevalent in the months, years to come. I mean, like, my 11-year-old daughter was telling me for a while she's non-binary. I mean, I'd never say that to my father because I didn't even know what it was, because I never knew that was an option. I was told, good old Catholic schoolboy, you're either straight or you're gay. There's no in between. So, like, now knowing that this is more prevalent, of course, I'd love to hear more about this.
You know, it's very strange at the moment, because a lot of the things that I thought were issues that I thought were cut and dried by the 90s have come back to haunt us again. Like the huge amount of transphobia that we're seeing growing up in the States and in the UK. That's really worrying. It's just awful, you know. And I think we, as magical practitioners, I think that behooves us to kick against that, you know. And something that I do think has changed for the better is that occult communities in general seem to be more aware of these issues and more willing to, you know, critique, if you like, older generations of occultists who came out with shit like Gareth Knight did.
It's like
I think that's a continuing struggle, you know.
Because one thing I would like to share with you, especially you being one of my first forays into queer culture, was one of the reasons that my society, Mysterium Philippines, is very much behind and in 100% support of LGBTQ rights and expression in this country is because I used to live in the equivalent here in the Philippines of a city which would be the most red Republican state in America. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like a real, you know, red Bible beating state. And as an occultist, as a person who is very much into the occult, they would look at me in that city like I was the devil incarnate. And the only ones, one of the first people who came alongside me and who said, Robert, I want to see this dream of yours of a booming occult society come true, was an LGBTQ member. His name is Romel Panal. If you're seeing this, I love you and I miss you, brother. And the queer culture, the LGBT culture, showed much support and respect to me because and it had nothing to do with sexuality. It was just that they were asking people to be open-minded about them, and here comes me with my practices, and they were one of the only people to show me that kind of how do I say, respect. So when it came down to it, they were asking me like, Robert, does Mysterium support allowing of, you know, gay marriages and stuff like that? So definitely, especially in the Philippines, because if we want as occultists to be taken seriously by society in this country, the very bare minimum we should ask for is that our LGBT friends are treated like normal people and given the same rights, because that's a natural human phenomenon. Like, just because you like a man doesn't mean, and you're a guy, doesn't mean you don't deserve any less rights as the person who doesn't. So I said, maybe if this country gets mature enough to respect that right, the right of love, maybe one day they will learn to respect occultists as well. Yeah, so basically, that's one reason I've been very strong about this, because, and advocating for it, because even though I'm a straight heterosexual man, I'm also saying that, like, if they are mocking LGBTQ people, they're going to start burning occultists in this country. And I just don't want that to happen.
Yeah, that's definitely going to be on the ticket in Florida here at some point, because I mean, banning books, talking about eradicating trans people, all of this. The strange thing was, I was thinking, like, just the other day, that I had an appointment at the VA, and if you want to talk about old guard, closed-minded, right-wing, thinkers, that's where you're going to see it. When I went in for my yearly physical, they handed me a sheet with numbers on it, and it's got, at the top of straight, gay, queer was one of the selections, other, and then I don't know and I don't want to say. But it was interesting that they want to know, and that they want to be able to get you the kind of, if you need any special treatment, or if you're going to need, HRT at some point. I just thought it was interesting that the VA was actually coming out with, yes, we're going to start asking this, because that's the entire nation.
And that's actually a step in the right direction.
That's something else.
That's a step in the
right direction. It really is. I was surprised.
I think it's an interesting thing, because I think the increasing the acceptance of LGBTQIA people in North America has been driven in part because there are so many people serving, and Americans, in my experience, I might be wrong here, tend to respect people who want to serve their country.
Definitely.
That's just my impression. I might be wrong, but is that a kind of like interesting crossover between people who want to serve their country and being queer, and they get more accepted because, not necessarily primarily because they're queer, but primarily because they've been serving their country, and ordinary citizens respect that.
Well, America is very much a military country.
Yeah, and
very military, and veterans. They have a very special status here in America, and they talk about all the people who've served their country, and all men fought and died for these rights, and blah blah blah. And so to see the VA coming around on that. When I was in the Navy, we had people that were openly gay, openly lesbian, and it wasn't a thing, because they were still considered to be soldiers first, and then whatever you are second.
Later on, yeah. So the utility of it is always seen. Now, I have a question for you, Phil, about the whole idea of queering occultism. If you could have a wish of an impact that book could have, what would it be? Because I think all authors have that like when they write a book, they have like a secret wish that they'd like, I'm writing this book because I'm hoping and I'm wishing that this could happen. What would your wish be for such a wonderful book like Queerying Occultures?
Well, I guess, to be brutally honest, I hope that loads of people buy it,
Well, yeah, that's a given, definitely. And once again, we're going to post the link to get it. So please continue, though.
I mean, it's like I say, it's a book I've wanted to do for a very long time. And in fact, before the pandemic, I was discussing with a friend the idea of doing an anthology of queer writing, particularly from a kind of like a European or at least non-American perspective, or at least a different perspective than some of the stuff that's come out of late. And I think that's something I might return to at some point in the future. Because I actually do think anthologies where you have lots of different voices inputting their ideas is better than a single writer. It was just easier for me to kind of like collect some of the essays together that have been on my blog for the past decade or so, write some new material and bung it together and get Falcon to publish it. I was actually quite surprised that they did want it, because I was going to publish it myself, and then I thought, well, hang on, I've been with Falcon for 27 years. That seems to be a really long time. I better offer it to them just as an act of politeness, and they were kind of like, oh, we really want to publish this, and I was like, oh, cool. I didn't think you would.
I have also another question, though. One thing that real fans will know this about you, but a lot of people, of course, if I in the occult community mention Phil Hine, they will say it's either chaos magic or the whole querying aspect of things. But what people don't know about is your actual written letters on urban shamanism. If you don't mind me asking, where did that come from, and how does that fit in your practice nowadays? Okay, well, that's a set of 3 little chapbooks that I published in the mid-80s. I was actually thinking of kind of like, reissuing them with a lot of
with some of the other fragmentary stuff that never actually made it out, and some, footnotes saying this bit is really awful, but I'll see about that. It's an idea. But those 3 chapbooks came about because I was living in, as I say, I moved to Leeds in 1986, and I was involved a lot with people who were squatting and people on the, if you like, alternative scene. And I started thinking, there's people have problems that they want addressed by, if you like, magical practitioners, but none of these problems are in the books on magic. Most of the books I'd read on magic at that point had this kind of romantic idea of, magic as something that happened in the countryside, and there was nothing really that was written on it from a kind of like urban point of view. Like how do you deal with severe drug addiction, or being arrested by the cops, or having a court order placed against you, and the idea of the urban shaman trilogy was, it's a terrible thing, urban shamanism. It was something that was around at the time. I'm not apologizing for using the word shaman, because it was very in at the time when I was writing those books. That it was a kind of like, again, it was a kind of an idea of, let's get a very kind of like down to earth magical primer, but very much hooked into what it's like to be, living in a city, which in fact most of us do. And let's try and think about some of the, if you like, cultural issues that come up when we live in cities, and again, try and work out ways of dealing with them.
Epic. So do you ever intend to revisit that or relaunch that?
Yeah, I have been. The thing is, the books are out as PDFs, so you can pick them up online and read them for free. But I have been thinking about revisiting that material and, chucking in some things that I was planning to release but never did, and, kind of revisiting that whole era, really. And that kind of like predates a lot of my chaos magic stuff, but kind of like obviously feeds into it. And I was really influenced by, I did a degree in occupational therapy. And one of the interesting things about occupational therapy is it teaches you to have like a multi-disciplinary approach to a problem. So you have a patient and you have to think, well, how am I going to approach this patient's problem and give them the solution they need? Am I going to do a psychodynamic approach, psychoanalysis, something like that? Am I going to choose behaviorism or some other kind of like problem reduction technique? What it teaches you is to look at a situation and then choose the approach that most possibly fits that situation. And that was a big influence on me in doing the shamanic trilogy, and also later in approaching chaos magic. Let's look at a situation, assess it, plan our response, then do your response, obviously, and then think about whether it worked or not. Or maybe you could have done it in a different way,
It's kind of like a form of social engineering using occultism, right? Like handling with the social scene as an occultist in the city with these books. Am I correct?
Well, I wouldn't call it social engineering. I don't know, it sounds a bit weird to me, but we are social beings, and I think we need to utilize magic to enhance our lives wherever we were living. Whether you're living in a hut in the hills in some remote part of the world, or in downtown Seoul.
Well, before we go to the last segment of the show, I have one last question to ask you, which is, of all the workings you've done in your career as an occultist, what would you say was the most memorable, that's had the most positive impact on your life?
As in rituals?
Your rituals, spell, working, name it. You could be your HGA, could have been a summoning. What was the one that really had the most positive impact on your life?
That's very tricky. I can think of loads that have had impacts on my life, but I think there's I remember doing a ritual to the goddess Eris in must have been about 1989, something like that, and that kind of culminated in a kind of like really psychedelic vision, It was one of the most psychedelic visions I'd had without having to, imbibe any psychedelics for some time. And that, I think, just really affected me, that ritual, in a way I can't quite describe, but it's kind of like it left echoes and traces that seem to, even now I've got a tape recording of the ritual and I'll listen to it and it kind of like snaps me back to that moment. And I've had quite a few experiences since then that are like that. And I think this is perhaps one of the underappreciated things about magic, is that it can take years sometimes for the effects of a ritual to really kind of like filter through. And they leave echoes and traces, and sometimes something in your ordinary life can, snap you back or remind it or bring it to mind. And I think that's a really wonderful thing about magic.
And is this ritual in any of your written works or in your blogs, or is it just in your personal records?
I think it's just in my personal records, really.
All right. Of course.
I mean, there's a lot of stuff I've done that I've never actually shared with people because it's private, and I think that's absolutely okay.
Yeah, we respect that. But like everybody like to learn something at one point or another. So with that, we're going to give you your round of applause because we've learned so much from you. And we're now going to go to our last segment of the show. Mr. Hine, thank you. You're such a gentleman, which is the Occult Deck segment, where we're hoping that we could learn something amazing from you. Everything I've learned from you has just been on your written works, but imagine the day where I could actually learn something directly from the Phil Hine. It could be as complex, as simple, as easy as you want. If you want to talk about easy, Lon Milo Duquette taught us how to wax paper our tarot cards. So after all the build-up we got from him, we're like, okay, so we're good.
Well, this is a really simple thing. It's a practice I've been doing for, I don't know, it must be nearly 30 years now, more or less on a daily basis. You visualize the wrong one. You imagine a flame in the center of your being. And as you breathe in and out, the flame goes up and it goes down, and it's attuned with your heartbeat. However you want to do it, you have this flame in the center of your being. And every experience you have, whether it be good or bad or, nice or nasty, you throw into the flame, and the flame burns it up. And that's a very simple non-dual practice where you accept every experience, take it into your heart and offer it as a sacrifice. Now you can offer it as a sacrifice to yourself, or if you have a particular deity that you work with, you can offer it as you can see the flames as deity. And what you're doing is you're feeding your love of the deity, your wonder and your astonishment of the deity with your every waking experience. That's a very simple practice. I've been doing it for 30 years on a more or less daily basis, apart from when I forget. You can do it anywhere, you don't need to set aside time. I often do it when I'm walking around, if I'm shopping, or if I'm sitting on the train going somewhere. Very simple exercise.
Wow.
That's good. And that would actually kind of like get you towards releasing it so you're not hanging on to things.
Yeah.
What have been some of the benefits you've experienced doing this technique? Like, just curious, like, has it given you better sleep at night, more peace of mind? Has it made you less obsessive about things? What are some of the positives of doing this simple yet effective technique?
I think perhaps the most obvious one is it behoves you to be kind of, if you like, aware of your environment, which we're not all the time. I mean, I'm not all the time, but it's quite often it's just the case of, I'll be walking along and I'll see the play of sunlight in a puddle, and I think, oh, that's a nice, I'll stand there and watch the light dancing on the water and think, I'll offer that to the goddess.
Wow. So it's like your own ritual offering. Wherever you go, you have your own altar to offer.
I mean, there's an Indian poem called the Soundra Lahari, the Flood of Beauty. And there's a lovely couplet in that, and it says, whatever I experience is an offering to you. That little exercise is kind of just one example of that attitude. That everything that I experience comes from the goddess, and I offer back to her. And there's no real result. There's no kind of like big goal there, but it's just something that you might find nice to do.
I like it.
Yeah, we're gonna have that up on the website soon, and that's of course when we do that, it's gonna be on as an infographic on Instagram. But of course, all credit will go to you for it. Thank you very much, Phil, for that very very amazing technique. I mean, I'm very eager to see how that will help in my building of my relationship with my patron Anubis or with other spirits I work with, especially on an evocational level. So before we conclude tonight's episode, we'd like to allow you right now to plug anything you'd like to, upcoming books, courses, workshops you're going to be offering so that the crowd knows where to find you.
Well, you can point people towards my blog. I've just started a Substack newsletter. Up and coming things. There's a book hopefully coming out later this year that I've co-edited with Rodney Orpheus, rock and roll star for lyric writer. It's called Delinquent Elementals, and what it is, it's an anthology of material from a magazine that we created together called Pagan News, which was the UK's first monthly pagan zine. And although it's pagan, it's pagan in the widest possible sense. So that'll be interviews, humor, articles, letters from people complaining about us being on the left-hand path. Everything that we found funny and wanted to stick together, and that'll be coming out later this year. I also want to mention my own publishing imprint, Twisted Trunk. I've done 2 books of rare tantric material translations from Mike McGee, who's a very noted occult scholar of Tantra, and there'll be probably more from Twisted Trunk over the next year or so.
Wonderful.
And I think that's about it.
Don't forget
to check it out.
Your book again, please. The book that you're selling now, Queerying Occultures. Can you please hold it on camera and tell us where to get it and what's it about? One last time.
Available from Amazon or Original Falcon. I forget what the year is. You look it up. Original Falcon Press, as in print or in digital form, or from Amazon, and hassle your local occult store to stock it. That would be great.
I'll talk to Ancient Ways, see if they carry it already.
And the cover is by my partner Maria, and it's called Snails in Love.
Beautiful.
There's a foreword from Patricia McCormack, and a contribution essay from Lou Hart, who's one of the founders of the UK's Queer Pagan Camp. So beautiful. I hope you enjoy it if you read it.
Yes, we are. And actually, I'll be writing a review once I'm done reading it. I'm already entranced by what I'm reading, and I'm hoping that more books will come from you, Mr. Hine, because you've been nothing short of an inspiration to people like me in my occult journey.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you.
Absolutely. Right, so I'm deeply enjoying the book.
Yes, so we're going to end the show now, but please don't leave, because usually we like to say goodbye in private to our guests. So we're going to remove Mr. Hine from the show right now, and then we're going to wrap up tonight's show. Thank you again, Mr. Hine, for joining us. You're a real gentleman. Remember, check out his official page, enfolding.org, and that's where all of his blog stuff is. I'm sure you're going to learn a lot from there. So once again, Mr. Hine, thank you for that. So Wade, wow. That was Phil Hine. Wow. And
amazing show.
Amazing show. So much we've learned from him, and so much I'm sure we're going to learn. Let's hope to have him again in the future. But season 2 is not yet over, because we have a surprise guest at the very end of the season who's going to be joining us. We're not going to reveal who it is yet, but it's really going to tear your skin off. So we're going to end the stream right now. Wade, see you in a couple of days. Take care, brother.
You too.